Welcome back to the One Winning Pod Ravens History Corner. This coming week, the Ravens will be traveling back to MetLife Stadium for the second time this season to take on the New York Giants. As you know, this will be a matchup that will reunite the Ravens with a familiar face to the franchise, and that will be Don Wink Martindale, who was the sixth defensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens in their franchise's history. Martindale was coordinator from 2018 through 2021, overseeing some very strong units before the injury rug fell out from under him last season. This will be far from the first time the Ravens will be facing off against a former defensive coordinator, as all previous coordinators to Mike Macdonald, outside of Greg Madison, have gone on to either head coaching or defensive coordinator positions with other teams after their time in Baltimore. So the subset of 5 games to choose from to compare to what this week's matchup will be, we'll be looking at the top 5 memorable games where the Ravens and a former defensive coordinator faced off for the first time. At number 5 on this list, we're going to start out by looking at the very first instance of this type of game in Ravens history. As many fans remember, Marvin Lewis was a defensive coordinator for those great Ravens defenses early in the franchise's history, serving in the position from 1996 through 2001. He performed so well that he left Baltimore after the 2001 season due to his name being heavily in the mix for head coaching opportunities that had opened up. Unfortunately for Lewis, he would not be the finalist for any in 2002, having to settle for a year as a defensive coordinator for Washington. But in 2003, the Cincinnati Bengals would give him a shot for a position that he would end up holding for nearly a decade and a half, and that would be the head coaching job. This would set up the first of many matchups between the Ravens and their former defensive coordinator, and their first meeting would be in Week 6 of the 2003 season. Even though these two would be destined for many memorable matchups to come, this first meeting was a dud from the Ravens' perspective. The game would start out well in the Ravens' favor, as they would take the opening drive for a 19-yard touchdown pass from Kyle Bowler to Travis Taylor, but that's where the good fortune would end for the Ravens that day. The next 2 Ravens drives would end with Kyle Bowler surrendering the ball to Cincinnati on fumbles, which Cincinnati quickly converted into 14 points. Then early in the second quarter, Bengals quarterback John Kitna would challenge Ed Reed deep, floating a ball just over Reed's airborne fingers en route to an 82-yard touchdown pass to Chad Johnson. The Bengals got into high control on this game, taking a 34-10 lead on the first play of the fourth quarter. The Ravens would attempt a comeback here with some garbage time touchdowns, but their onside kick attempt would fail, leaving Marvin Lewis with a 34-26 win. The game would be an emotional win for Lewis. The Associated Press's account of the game notes that Lewis was visibly more animated with players in this game, and that would end up being only his second win as a head coach to that date. Baltimore would get Lewis in again in the meeting in Baltimore in 2003, but this game in particular, not a very good one for the Ravens. At number 4 on this list, this is a game that we already discussed in the very first History Corner, but we focused on the game from a different angle in that recap. The game in question is from the Week 5 of the 2007 season, with the Ravens taking on former defensive coordinator from 2002 to 2004, the man who replaced Lewis, Mike Nolan. Nolan became the head coach for the 49ers and brought with him the Ravens' philosophy of strong defense paired with a ground-and-pound offense. Now, this game would turn into what would basically look like the 2000 Ravens playing themselves. You even had Trent Dilfer filling in at quarterback for an injured Alex Smith in this matchup. The game began with 8 consecutive drives ending in a punt before Baltimore grinded out 2 clock-eating field goal drives to take a 6-0 lead into halftime. The pace of the second half would end up being essentially the same, with the only offensive fireworks being Dilfer's touchdown pass to wide receiver Arnaz Battle to bring San Francisco within 2. The Ravens' defense would be able to hold, though, as they would take the win 9-7. At number 3 on this list, this is one I put higher than number 4, not because the game was good, but because a franchise record was established during it. After the 2017 season, Ravens defensive coordinator Dean Pease announced his retirement from the NFL, and the Ravens promoted Don Wink Martindale to take his place. However, a few weeks later, Pease would come out of retirement to become the defensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans. The Ravens would travel to Nashville to take on Pease and left with an easy 21-0 victory. The Ravens' offense wasn't particularly sharp or poor in this game, doing basically all they needed to do to win. What was memorable about this matchup was the performance that was put on by the defense. The Ravens came into the game with only 5 sacks on the season, but Wink's scheme, already billed as more aggressive than what the Ravens had been doing with Pease, overwhelmed Titans quarterback Marcus Mariota and the offensive line to the tune of 11 sacks. Zadarius Smith, Peanut Owasu, Tony Jefferson, Matt Judon, Terrell Suggs, Kenny Young, Anthony Levine, and Chris Wormley would all take down Mariota before the game ended, and would in turn have a franchise record for a single game in that matchup. 11 sacks by the defense in a game still stands as a franchise record currently for the Ravens. At number 2 on this list, this was an emotional game for the Ravens for a lot of reasons. The 2012 AFC wildcard game against the Colts was obviously the last time Ray Lewis played an NFL game at M&T Bank Stadium, but the game was also the first time the Ravens would play their defensive coordinator from 2011, Chuck Pagano. The matchup was emotional due to Pagano's return to Baltimore, but also, and more importantly, the circumstances that led to it. Pagano had been diagnosed with leukemia early in the 2012 season and would miss weeks 5 to 16 of the regular season receiving treatment. Needless to say, while Ravens fans desperately wanted to see a win for Ray in this game, the flock was happy to see former coach Pagano in the game after what had been a very difficult time for him. As for the game itself, I think you all know about what happened here. The Ravens' defense held rookie Andrew Luck's offense in check, while Joe Flacco's deep ball would be on fire, connecting with Anquan Boldin for 145 yards and a touchdown en route to a victory that was never in doubt. Which brings us to number 1 on this list, and this one honestly wasn't even a question for me. This game is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated regular season games in Ravens history, one of the greatest season-opening games that this franchise has ever seen, and that would be the Ravens opening up the 2010 season on Monday Night Football in New York, first game for the Jets in MetLife Stadium against former defensive coordinator Rex Ryan. This game was a defensive slugfest, similar in scoring to the 49ers game that we discussed earlier, but the difference here was that some plays were made on offense. This wasn't a case of 2 bad offenses getting dominated by excellent defense. This was 2 mediocre offenses going up against 2 dominant defenses, and honestly, that was enough of a difference to make this game actually exciting. Really, if you like defensive battles in football, if you're a Ravens fan, I have to imagine you're at worst neutral to them. This one had it all for you. Turnovers, big hits, big-name players making big-name plays. Both defenses pushed the other offenses to their limits. Both teams' rushing attacks were not able to get any traction. The Ravens' defense held Mark Sanchez to 74 passing yards while only surrendering 116 yards on the ground. The difference in the game turned out to be Flacco's ability to place some timely deep balls in possession for his receivers to leap over defenders and grab it where either they got it or no one else did. And Flacco made enough of those plays to get the Ravens 10 points of offense. This led to a tight 10-9 lead with 4 minutes and 27 seconds left to go in regulation and the ball on the Ravens' 26-yard line. In need of a big play to flip the field position, Flacco lofted a deep pass to Todd Heap, who had to lunge forward to secure the pass over former Ravens safety Jim Leonard. The Ravens did have to punt on this drive, but the offense had done their job, pinning the Jets deep in their own territory with less than 2 minutes to go in regulation. The defense would take over from there, highlighted by Ray Lewis absolutely leveling Jets tight end Dustin Keller to force an incompletion and ultimately the end of the push for the Jets. The Ravens would hold on to win the game 10-9. And there you have it. My list for the top 5 most memorable first-time matchups between the Ravens and former defensive coordinators. To review, the games were as follows. Number 5, Ravens at Bengals from 2003 against Marvin Lewis. Number 4, Ravens at 49ers in 2007 against Mike Nolan. Number 3, Ravens at Titans from 2018 against Dean Pease. Number 2, Ravens versus the Colts in 2012 against Chuck Pagano. And number 1, Ravens at the Jets in Week 1 of 2010 against Rex Ryan. That's all for this week, and remember to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, as well as our podcast for great Ravens content all season long.